So Iran is making Israel an offer it can't refuse. Either allow a Palestinian state or it's the end of Israel. Live from deep in the hood, this is the Eurasian Century. One thing I've noticed when the spotlight moved from the Ukraine to the Middle East, even in the alternative media, is that most Westerners don't understand any more about the Middle East than they do about the Russian world. Um, there's been some good reporting in the alternative and independent media, um, but there's some blind spots. I got used to it with the Ukraine coverage, but it's been really conspicuous to me of late regarding the Middle East. I hear things like Sunnis and Shiites hate each other and will never cooperate. I hear that Iran has been fine with Israel. It's just Gaza that set them off. Hear misconceptions about Sharia and Muslim attitudes, as well as ignorance regarding Israeli demography and the ascent of the Eastern Jews there. So, to kill as many of these birds with one stone as possible, I decided to do a program on Iran. So I want to talk about several facets of Iran. First, its relationship with Russia. Iran and Russia have had a long and complicated history, characterized by alternating eras of peace and conflict, coinciding with the ebb and flow of military power between the two countries. Significant area of the southern border of the Russian Empire was obtained in conquest from Iran. And Russia in past centuries has effectively occupied a number of Iranian cities, including Tehran, over a span of years. During the early Soviet period, relations were periodically volatile with changes in borders and influence. From the Islamic Revolution of 1979 to around 1989, relations were poor due to the incompatibility of communism and Islam. However, since then, with a brief respite in the early 2000s due to Russia's recognition of Western sanctions, relations have steadily improved, especially since the JCPOA, the Iran Peace Treaty, initially lifted sanctions in 2009, to the point that currently the two countries have engaged in strategic partnership bordering on military alliance. The JCPOA was the nuclear containment or anti-nuclear treaty with Iran. The pivoting of both Iran and Russia to the east as a result of sanctions imposed against them and the common threat imposed by America and its proxies has served to drive the two ever closer together. The relationship with China. I'm not going to go into extensive detail regarding Chinese-Iranian relations, except to say that Iran and China have a number of mutual agreements, including some joint military exercises and a 25-year cooperation treaty. Moreover, Iran joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization agreement in June of 2023 and has been invited to join BRICS in January of next year. China brokered a peace treaty between Iran and Saudi Arabia early in 2023. And finally, Iran is a key participant in China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Iran is important for several other reasons besides their relationship to Russia and China. They were the first of the Muslim countries to fully embrace the idea of an Islamic revival. Iran led the West Asian countries in this respect, and in 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who had been exiled in Paris, returned to Iran, effectively deposing the ruling king, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had left the country for medical treatment. Pahlavi was reestablished in power by the United States pursuant to a coup d'etat in 1953 against then Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Pahlavi ruled in Iran as Shah since 1941, and Mossadegh had been appointed in 1951 pursuant to legislative elections in 1950. At this time, Iran was a constitutional monarchy with a parliament. However, Mossadegh announced he intended to nationalize the oil industry controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Petroleum Company. The parliament then voted to do just that, which resulted in 2 attempted coups against Mossadegh. The first failed and resulted in Pahlavi's temporary exile. The second was successful against Mossadegh and reinstalled Pahlavi and appointed another prime minister. So this all happened back in the 50s. The point there is America really installed the Shah of Iran and supported him as a anti-communist figure and against nationalizing forces in Iran. Fast forward to 1979, as we mentioned before, Ruhollah Khomeini. Following his overthrow of Pahlavi, Khomeini established a theocracy. The clerical class actually has the supreme authority in the country. The supreme leader, now Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is the last word on all political decisions other than a council of 88 Islamic experts, scholars, they're called mujtahids, who have the power to elect a new leader and, at least theoretically, have the power to depose him. In some ways, this arrangement functions as a constitutional monarchy largely out of necessity. There's a parliament called the Majlis and a president who is the head of the government for practical purposes. Yet the current president, for example, Hojatollah Ebrahim Raisi, is a cleric himself, and the clerical class has control of the direction of policy. To say the least, this makes Iran a bastion of traditionalism. However, Shiite tradition is somewhat different from Sunni tradition. For example, Shiites are much more comfortable with images of leaders displayed in public, especially in religious contexts, than Sunnis. And we'll get to more of those differences later in the program. But I want to kind of look in on, give a rundown of Shiite Islam, Twelver Shiite Islam, and I'll explain what Twelver means. Because it's highly relevant and there are misconceptions about the current distance between the Shiites and the Sunnis. The name Shia comes from Shiat Ali, or the Party of Ali. To boil down a complicated subject, there was a dispute which only became truly sectarian later in Islamic history, a dispute in the early Islamic community between those who followed certain companions of Muhammad as his legitimate successors and rightful leaders, who they called Khalifa, and those who believed that at least the first 3 of these leaders actually were usurpers, and by right of blood, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, had the right to lead the community. Ali eventually became the 4th Khalifa, or Caliph. However, the dichotomy continued between dueling customs: election of a Caliph by the inner circle of leadership, or an Imam, which is what the Shiites eventually called the leadership, descended by bloodline. The main body of Muslims, about 85% or so, are Sunnis. This comes from Ahl-Sunnati wal Jama'ah, the people of tradition and consensus. The 2 sects diverge after a conflict that took the life of Ali and then his sons, Hassan and Hussein, and so eventually Shiites came to see Ali as the first Imam, or literally exemplar or example, of the Shiite community, and his sons as the 2nd and 3rd Imams. Twelver Shiites, the sect that rules Iran, recognize 12 of these Imams as authoritative and have a different school of Sharia from the Sunnis based on the writings of the sixth Imam, Ja'far al-Sadiq, who is also respected in Sunni Islam. The divergence into discrete sects, that is, was gradual. Um, what is not commonly understood in the West is that the mutual hostility that sometimes erupts between the sects is primarily political and ethnocultural, rather than religious per se. Sunni Islam is divided into four schools of jurisprudence, or madhabs: Hanafi, Shafi, Maliki, and Hanbali. Every Sunni Muslim belongs to one of these schools. They all recognize each other as legitimate because they all follow the jurisprudence and opinions about Sharia of early scholars accepted by the Sunni community. The differences between these schools, they're not sects, they're just different schools of Islamic law or Sharia. And so, where a person stands, either at the head of the deceased or at the foot of the deceased when holding a funeral, or where a person holds their hands in particular during certain postures in prayer, that kind of thing constitutes most of the differences between them. What is little understood in the West is that Ja'far al-Sadiq, in addition to being the sixth Imam, according to the Shiite reckoning, and the founder of their school of jurisprudence, the Jafari, is also a respected scholar in Sunni Islam. There have been repeated attempts to reconcile the two groups on the lines that the Jafari school of Islamic jurisprudence, or madhab, should be recognized as a legitimate fifth school of Islam among the Sunnis, thus healing the schism. In looking through the attempts at reconciliation, a particular fact becomes clear. The Sunni Shiite division in Islam is more comparable to what Orthodox Christians call a schism rather than an actual heretical divide. That is, they don't actually disagree on theology for the most part. At least the Twelver Shiites and the Sunnis don't. For example, in 1743, the Iranian Nader Shah made an attempt for rapprochement through a convention of Shiite, mainly Iranian, and Sunni, mainly Hanafi scholars, resulting in a document in which the former agreed to forego the custom of cursing the first three caliphs, and the latter agreed to recognize Twelver Shi'ism as a fifth Orthodox madhab, or school of Islamic thought. In the early 20th century, between 1911 and 1936, the Lebanese Shiite Mujtahid Abdul Hussein Sharaf ad-Din maintained a correspondence in the same spirit with the rector of the Al-Azhar, Salim al-Bishri. A Mujtahid is somebody who has, in Shiite Islam, who has the ability to make decisions about Islamic law. Rashid Rida, editor of the Sunni revivalist Al-Manar, met in the General Islamic Congress in Jerusalem in December of 1931 with the Iraqi Shiite jurist Muhammad al-Hussein al-Kashif al-Ghita, and expressed his support for rapprochement. Another initiative was taken by the Egyptian Sheikh Mustafa al-Maraghi in the late 1930s. The cause of rapprochement was taken up in the formation in Cairo from 1946 until 1972 of Jamaat al-Taqrib, the group of rapprochement under the Iranian Shiite scholar Muhammad Taqi Qumi, and the professed goal of the group was the unification of the various schools and legitimizing the Shia as a separate Jafari school. In 1959, Mahmoud Shaltut, then head of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which is one of the most distinguished universities in all of the Islamic world, who had been involved in the Jamaat al-Taqrib, which I mentioned before, issued a historic fatwa recognized the Jafari, or Ashia al-Islamiyya al-Ithna Ashariya, the 12 Imam Shiites, as a madhab that is religiously correct to follow and worship as are other Sunni schools of thought. And as recently as 2003, King Abdullah accepted the petition of leaders of the Saudi Shiites, which included demands for religious equality and seemed to indicate that he was willing to consider a change in the traditional attitudes of the Wahhabi state towards the Shiites, although this was resisted by the Wahhabi clerics. Now, Sunni enthusiasm about rapprochement diminished significantly after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And the banner of Taqrib, which means reconciliation, was taken up almost immediately by the followers of the Shiite revolution in Iran, though. Shortly after the Islamic Revolution, the regime formed organizations to promote the idea of unity of all Islamic schools and legitimizing the Shia as the Jafari school within a generic Islam that was neither Sunni nor Shiite. The two main organizations operating under the Iranian regime in the spirit are the Ahlul Bayt, headed until 1999 by Hajatullah Ali Tashkiri, then by Ali Akbar Vilayati, and since October 2002 by Sheikh Mohammed Mahdi As-Safi. And the other one is the Majma Jahani Baraye Taqrib Beni Mazahib Islami, Society for Reconciliation Between the Schools, under Hajatullah Muhammad Vaizadeh Khorasani. Both organizations convene conferences ostensibly for rapprochement between Sunni and Shiite Muslims and organize programs for Sunni Muslims to study Islam in the madrasas of Qom, which is a famous Persian Iranian center of religious education. This is highly significant. We were discussing the support of Sunni organizations like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas by Shiite Iran. Iran is open to interaction and assistance, and that is the more important variable when Iran is the one from whom the funds, weapons, and training is coming. As far as the Sunni organizations, Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Palestine, Hamas, for one, has taken weapons and money from the Israelis and from the Americans. The Americans, especially when they were fighting Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So they're not picky about where they get weapons and training and money, and I don't think Palestinian Islamic Jihad is either. In March of 2023, the Chinese brokered a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Both Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as Turkey, attended the recent meeting of the Arab and Muslim heads of state to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian question. Finally, in May of 2023, Bashar al-Assad, the leader of Syria, was welcomed back into the Arab League, a largely Sunni organization. This is relevant because Assad is also a Shiite of the Alawi sect, thus his reception is another indicator of sectarian thawing. Now, with respect to BRICS, Iran is predominantly Shiite, about 90%. This matters because Iran can be dealt with as a distinctive culture and polity different from Sunni Arabs, both in language and religious culture. Russia has a long history of relations with Iran since the 16th century, with limited periods of conflict. As I remarked before, this is vital for Russia because its southern border is inhabited by the people of the Stans, who are also Muslim. Iran was recently invited to join BRICS along with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and so the whole Muslim world is in play in the great game. Iran and Saudi will be competing for status not only in the Muslim world, but in the BRICS coalition, and BRICS is morphing into a counterweight for the G7 and the West in general. That explains the mystery of what happened to India. India, for now, has elected to remain unaligned and open to being wooed by either the East or the West. Iran has long ago abandoned any such sentiments. Saudi Arabia is in a similar position to India, but their movement is definitely eastward. The recent Hamas attack and Israel's response has scuttled a potential treaty between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Um, Now the Saudis are making this contingent upon any progress contingent upon the formation of a Palestinian state, sovereign Palestinian state, the two-state solution. Involvement in BRICS will solidify this trajectory. Now I want to talk a little bit about heartland geography and trade. In this program and the next, I'm going to refer to Halford Mackinder's paper, the Geographical Pivot of History, from 1904 on the Heartland Theory, regarding world hegemony or control, as well as his updated Midland Basin Theory from 1941 and Nicholas Speakman's alternative Rimland Theory from the same period. There's these three theories: Heartland Theory, Midland Basin Theory, and Rimland Theory. Essentially, what I'm going to be suggesting is that both Mackinder's theories were valid in their eras, as was Speakman's, as an alternative to the original Heartland Theory. But today, due to the divergence in cultures between the US and UK and the political turmoil in both, Mackinder's revised theory of the Midland Basin as being a sufficient counterweight to the Heartland has become more problematic, and Speakman's alternative likely is the most accurate of the three. Now, the Heartland Theory essentially says that whoever controls the Heartland, that is Eurasia, Eastern Europe, essentially Eastern to Central Europe, potentially controls the world. His whole scheme revolves around the idea of land powers and sea powers. And he thinks the land powers have a decisive advantage if their position is defensible, if they control enough territory in the heartland. He updated this theory as the Midland Basin Theory in 1941, probably due to the fact that his original theory was from 1904 and two world wars had occurred in the meantime, or one world war had occurred and another one had gotten started. In the Midland Basin Theory, he argued that it was possible for either a heartland power, Eurasian power, to dominate global politics, or for a country that occupied the Midland Basin, which is essentially the midland between Western Europe and the United States. What he's talking about, the Midland Basin, is basically the Transatlantic Alliance, and that was becoming very powerful during the period when he issued his second theory. Now, the alternative, the Rimland Theory, from the same period, suggests that whoever controls the area bordering the heartland will necessarily have the power to control, necessarily become a global hegemon, or has the power to become so. I would suggest that the heartland, Russia, in its inclusion in its alliance of China and Iran, as well as other West Asian countries, that is the Middle East, will effectively control enough of the rimland to enable this alliance to achieve global economic hegemony. Whether they will do so, whether they will pursue a multipolar framework, I think they will, but at the same time, politics is a matter of what you potentially can do, which everybody can calculate. I think the potential is definitely there for global economic hegemony. Now, I don't think the Russians or the Chinese are going to invade Central or Eastern Europe either. economic is the most important word in that phrase, global economic hegemony. Now, I'm not a geographical determinist, and I don't rely completely on Mackinder's or Speakman's work. But when they are taken together with Vladimir Putin's doctoral thesis in economics on the natural resources market, um, it paints a different picture. His theory suggests that the wealth of nations is ultimately measured in their natural resources, especially energy, and the simultaneous convergence of the prerequisites for all three theories, Mackinder's, Speakman's, and Putin's, in the Eurasian alliance, in my opinion, will likely be overwhelming over time. If one is skeptical of the value of the former two academics' work, one should consider why America is adamant about expanding NATO all the way to the Russian border. Such activity is completely in keeping with the theories of both Mackinder and Speakman regarding the vital significance of the Rimland area. It is no coincidence that policymakers in the State Department are adamant that America simply cannot afford to be nudged out of both the Eurasian heartland, Russia and China, and the Rimland, West Asia or the Middle East. If one is skeptical of Putin's theory regarding the appearance or centrality of natural resources, one should examine the details of the Ukraine war and the ineffectiveness of Western sanctions on Russia in light of its pivot eastward. China's BRI connects China and Russia with Europe through both land routes, through West Asia, Turkey, and into Europe, as well as sea routes from the south of China around India and Arabia and up through the Suez Canal into the Med and Europe. Thus, the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, must pass closely above and below Israel. But not only this, Israel itself has applied to be a part of the BRI, much to the chagrin of Washington, and to have its port in Haifa serve as an integral part of the initiative. Having greater control over the region of West Asia through weakening America's connection with Israel would greatly benefit this project by preventing the interference of either the U.S. or Israel with these trade routes as it interfered with the Nord Stream pipeline into Europe. Bear in mind, just in April of this year, after having negotiated a peace treaty between Iran and Saudi Arabia, China offered to negotiate a settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but this went nowhere. None of these things, including the Israeli and American reaction to the Hamas attack, are coincidental. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about nomenclature here. The axis of evil, according to Bush, and the axis of resistance, according to Iran and others. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization includes the facet of a loose military alliance, or security alliance, though it is not a revival of the Warsaw Pact, at least not yet. Iran was admitted to the SCO this past June and will be admitted to the BRICS in January of 2024. In recent years, Iran has enlisted several countries and groups in West Asia and the bordering areas to constitute a defensive network in light of Israeli and American aggressive intent and actions towards it. This includes a crescent of countries, from Iran through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, right up to Israel's northern border, where Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy, holds decisive political power with a substantial army. This crescent dips down into Palestine through Iran's Sunni allies, Islamic Jihad in Palestine, and Hamas. Iran, through its Revolutionary Guards, funds, trains, and supplies both groups, though it is closer to Islamic Jihad. Hamas temporarily fought against Iranian interests in Syria against the regime of Bashar al-Assad, who was supported by Hezbollah. However, Hamas on the one hand and Assad and Iran on the other hand have reconciled between them. It was back in 22. They started meeting and they have been fine with each other ever since then. The original axis of evil in Western parlance during the Bush era was Iran, Iraq before the Second Gulf War, and North Korea. In reaction, Iran formed the crescent described above as its axis of resistance. Sometimes even Russia is described as being part of this resistance axis, and the term is entered Russian parlance as os сопротивления. This is probably an exaggeration of Russia's role in the endeavor. The other members are all Muslim, mostly Shiite actors, but they all do work in concert, though they seek to preserve a certain autonomy and thus deniability for their actions from the others in the group for various reasons, which I'll get to in a few minutes. Now, about the Hamas attack on October the 7th. The thing necessary to understand about the Hamas attack is that while the Wall Street Journal story, which I referred to in an earlier program, that shortly came out before or after October 7th, is likely true, that is, that Iran greenlit the attack or, in effect, gave its approval to the plan at a meeting with Hamas in Beirut shortly before the attack. But it is also true that it likely did not order the attack. The former, approval, merely implicates it, just as its funding, supplying, and training of Hamas implicates it under international law. I would be really surprised if Hamas didn't run this by Iran before they did it, because they would be putting their financing in question. The latter, ordering it, would render it complicit, though, under international law, and therefore an attack by Israel against Iran would be justified thereby. According to the International Court of Justice, International Court of Justice, armed attacks not only include action by a state's regular armed forces, but also the sending by or on behalf of a state of armed bands, groups, irregulars, or mercenaries, which carry out acts of armed force against another state of such gravity as to amount to an actual armed attack conducted by regular forces, or its substantial involvement therein. This is from the Paramilitary Activities Case, paragraph 195, quoting the definition of aggression annexed to the UN General Assembly Resolution 3314. Merely supplying and funding the attack would allow Israel to pursue Iran in court, but substantial involvement, that is, ordering, is necessary to justify retaliation without being accused of aggression under international law. I addressed the details of the attack in a previous video. However, since then, several things have become clear. First, the death toll was Israeli death toll was 1,200 rather than 1,400. 200 of those were Hamas, apparently. Second, up to half of these victims, at least 300 or 400, were either Israeli civilians or military being held as hostages who were killed in the attacks on Hamas by Tzahal, the Israeli military, as friendly fire. Israel has a harsh policy of disregarding the lives of hostages used as human shields. This is called the Hannibal Directive, I think. Third, the rumors of beheaded and burned babies were inaccurate propaganda. Most everyone killed by fire was killed by Tzahal attacks of the areas where Hamas and its hostages were located. There's never been any plausible evidence of beheadings offered. Nonetheless, many civilians were killed, both by Hamas and Tzahal. But the implications of the aftermath of the attack and subsequent Israeli response were not initially clear, but now for some time we have seen a picture emerging which should cause Israel itself and its allies significant concern. Immediately after the attack, in less than 24 hours, Hezbollah opened up a second front by commencing low-level attacks on Israeli positions in northern Israel. This had the effect of causing the civilian population of much of the north of the country to evacuate. Hezbollah has announced that they would shower Israel with missiles, and they have from 120 to 150,000 high-grade missiles, and invade northern Israel if Israel went full tilt boogie into Gaza. And Israel hesitated. Then the Israelis entered Gaza in much smaller numbers after a relentless campaign of indiscriminate carpet bombing, killing countless civilians. Last count was over 14,000. Hezbollah also announced that if it appeared to them that Israel was in danger of wiping out Hamas, they would also intervene. This has set up a pincer dynamic, which is causing Israel much difficulty and angst. Israel has had to move 25 to 50% of certain key categories of forces to northern Israel to guard against a Hezbollah invasion. This detracts from its capabilities in the south. As a result, Israel has only managed to enter the perimeter of the area they have cordoned off in the north of Gaza, but not into the heart of it. And they have incurred serious losses. Essentially, Hezbollah's actions have likely upset Israel's plan of ethnic cleansing the Palestinian population out of Gaza into the Sinai Desert, which, at least initially, that was their intent, and probably still is if they can achieve it. Ethnic cleansing, I mean, basically driving by killing the population out of an area without really concerned about how many people you kill. But that's not all. Iranian-linked forces in Syria and Iraq have engaged in continuous and serious strikes on U.S. bases in the region almost since the beginning of the conflict. American casualties are not being reported, and news of them is being suppressed, but they are substantial. In retaliation, the U.S. has struck alleged Iranian assets in Syria and Iraq. Thus, there is a low-level regional war in progress. U.S. efforts to obtain a ceasefire have been ineffective, and only a very temporary and limited 4-day humanitarian pause has been agreed to at this point. However, many people anticipate that the release of hostages will be strung out and extend this, but there's no guarantee of that. A meeting of Arab and Muslim powers in the region convened in Riyadh, and though it condemned Israeli actions and called for a two-state solution, concrete United steps were not implemented. Before the meeting, Russia and China had called for a ceasefire and negotiation conference, which China formally proposed after the Arab and Muslim Regional Conference. BRICS also held an emergency meeting requested by Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi and chaired by South Africa on November 21st, which also called for an immediate ceasefire and a conference to settle the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. What Iran has accomplished, with a little help from its friends, is remarkable. It has effectively put Israel in a vice to which it alone has the key and can ratchet up pressure on the Jewish state at will. This pressure is aimed at forcing Israel to either implement the creation of a sovereign and independent Palestinian state or face indefinite and continuous violence at the hands of the axis of resistance, including Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hamas. They have demonstrated American impotence when it comes to curtailing Israel from engaging in truly atrocious ethnic cleansing, the killing of large numbers of civilians, bombing them and driving them from their homes with impunity on the international stage in front of the mass media. They have embittered the Islamic world and turned most of the global South against Israel. And due to its refusal to insist on a ceasefire in defense of Israeli actions against America itself. And they have even divided public opinion in the West against the best efforts of governments and the Israeli lobby, resulting in massive demonstrations in London, New York, and elsewhere. I, for one, am impressed. If you find this program valuable, please hit like and subscribe. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.